If you're watching this on the day that it comes out, then you know we're in the middle of one of the biggest weekends in grappling history. But how did we get from a bunch of Brazilian dudes fighting on a beach to now two major events happening in Las Vegas with literally millions of dollars of grand prizes on the line? Well, that's what we're going to talk about in today's video. Guys, I'm Sean with PDMA, and today we're going to cover the history of competition in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. We're going to go over everything from it starts back in Brazil to the modern day and pretty much how we got to this weekend. Now keep in mind when you're watching this video, this isn't a comprehensive list of every single Jiu-Jitsu tournament, every single match, nothing like that. We're just going to hit some of the highlights, and if you think I missed something, feel free to leave it in the comments. With that being said, we're also going to talk about this concept of prize money. It's not going to be the main focus of the video, but I do want to talk about it because I think it is relevant, especially considering that, again, this weekend, if you're watching this when it comes out, literally millions of dollars are on the line, and I kind of want to talk about how we got there. So with that out of the way, let's get started. So this video is not going to be a comprehensive history of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu or anything like that. There's plenty of other videos out there that do a great job of recapping that history. Today, again, we're going to be focused on competitions. So our story is going to start in 1973 in Brazil with a tournament that has a Portuguese name that I'm not even going to attempt to say out of respect for my Brazilian and Portuguese friends, but in English they just called it the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu Championship. This was put on by the Gracie family, and it's pretty universally accepted as the first real Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu tournament. Nothing fancy, not a ton of information out there on this. Seems like it was just a couple of the Gracies wanted to show what they were doing. Now in 1984, Holz Gracie put on something he called the Copa Holz. Again, sorry for my Portuguese, but that's what he called it. And people kind of recognize that as, okay, so this Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu Championship, maybe that was like a one-off, but this 1984 event was really the event that kind of showed the world, okay, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is here to stay. Now keep in mind we're still in Brazil at this point, but it's starting to lay that foundation, lay the framework, and build upon the previous tournaments and matches as, okay, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is becoming something where these competitions are going to happen. Now, in the late 80s and early 90s, a lot was going on here, but I think something I want to mention is the Gracie Challenge matches. Now, keep in mind, Gracies had moved to the United States, some of them in Brazil, some of them in the United States, but the Gracie Challenge matches kind of hit their peak, again, in this late 80s, early 1990s period. Now, obviously, these are not a formal tournament like the last two things we talked about, but I think they are important because they exposed a lot of people, especially a lot of Americans, to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. The first Gracie Challenge match actually, believe it or not, took place in 1929, but I'm going to keep this in this part of the time frame just because, again, this is when the VHSs started to get popular. This is when people in the US really started to, the early adopters, started to come on to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. One of my coaches, Phil Miglerese, tells a story about how that's part of the reason he started was the Gracie Challenge matches, seeing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu kind of come into, maybe not the super popular culture, but work its way into the American zeitgeist. And I think that has a lot to do with these Gracie Challenge matches that were going on at this time. So in 1994 is when the IBJJF forms, and of course it looked a little bit different back then than it does today, but this is really, when we talk about laying the groundwork, starting to lay that groundwork for future competitions, and obviously the IBJJF is still a thriving organization today. It was originally organized by Carlos Gracie, but since then it's gone on to grow and become a real worldwide phenomenon. Most people in the sport are familiar with the IBJJF. Now, moving along here, we get to 1996, and what's important about 1996 is a couple things. So actually, this was the first year that the IBJJF held a Pan Am tournament, and it's the first year that they held Worlds. You may know the IBJJF World Championships at that time by another name, very commonly referred to as the Mundial. Talk to some of the old school guys, they still refer to it as that. But 1996 was actually the first year where we had that. Also around this time, and if you train Jiu-Jitsu on the East Coast like I do, this actually might be very interesting to you. It wasn't exactly 1996, but I couldn't get an exact year, so I put it in kind of in this time frame. Based on my sources, it was around the mid to late 90s. There was a Maxercise annual tournament. If you're not familiar with Maxercise, it was one of the first gyms on the East Coast run by Steve Maxwell. And this tournament was actually run by Helson Gracie himself, obviously with Steve Maxwell at his gym. And what's interesting about this was it was actually the first tournament on the East Coast that was held annually. So before, maybe a tournament had popped over to the East Coast now and again, but this was actually the first one that was held on an annual basis in the East Coast. And another one of my coaches, Ricardo Miglioris, he's the one that kind of turned me on to, he pointed me in this direction to research this. And it was very interesting. He actually sent me a couple pictures, which I'll put on the screen, of him in these tournaments. So 1998 was also a very pivotal year in Jiu-Jitsu history in terms of competition, because that was the year that ADCC was formed. Now, not only was it the year that ADCC was formed, but with the formation of ADCC, money started to come into the sport. Everything I talked about previously, for the most part, maybe there was a cash prize, a couple $100 here and there, but I mean, for the most part, you're actually almost looking entirely at a pay-to-play model. A lot of these tournaments you'd have to pay to sign up for. ADCC comes around, and you can win $10,000 in 1998. Now, keep that number in mind. Some of you might know why. But in 1998, that was the prize for first place in any given division, was $10,000, which in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu at that time was, it was unheard of. Again, small prizes here and there from some of these other competitions we talked about, maybe, if you were lucky. But for the most part, you were paying to be in these tournaments. Now with ADCC, you had the opportunity as a grappler to get paid, and not a small amount of money in 1998. So, not that the rest of the 90s and early 2000s wasn't pivotal in Jiu-Jitsu. Of course, things were steaming up, more competitions were coming on the scene, but I think this time, really, one of the things to focus on was the idea that the smaller tournaments were coming into play, which is very important. You had things like Grappler's Quest and Naga coming up around this point, and what those did was they gave people an opportunity to compete pretty close to their hometown for, again, maybe a small fee, but it started to build up that competitive landscape of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, where somebody who maybe wasn't looking to be a professional athlete, but still was practicing the martial art, and they wanted to test their skills, they had a lot more opportunity to do so around this time. Late 90s, early 2000s, we're talking a lot of formation here of these smaller leagues. And also what's happening now is that leagues like the IBJJF and ADCC, they're starting to build some steam as well. They're starting to become more legitimate sporting organizations, starting to attract bigger talent. Again, ADCC is paying, so that's super attractive to a lot of people in the sport. In 2005, ADCC introduced 2 women's divisions. Now, some of these other competitions did have women's divisions, but now this presented the first time for women to actually get paid for the sport. Now, as most of us know, they weren't getting paid as much as the men at the time, but it did introduce a way for women to make money in the sport for the first time, so I think that is a significant step along this path. Now, in 2009, we had another significant step of bringing money into jiu-jitsu competitions. So something called the Abu Dhabi World Pro League, or as you might know it, the World Professional Jiu-Jitsu Cup, formed in 2009, kind of changed names around 2014. Now, don't confuse this organization with ADCC. That is the Abu Dhabi Combat Club. This is the Abu Dhabi World Pro. Now, what's interesting about the Abu Dhabi World Pro is that they had some pretty significant prize pools. In 2009, the prize pools actually totaled at $110,000. And by 2019, that figure was up to $600,000 in total prize money. Not quite the million that we're going to get to with later tournaments, but it's a pretty significant amount of money to be going around for jiu-jitsu competition in 2009. So a couple years after that, in 2014, we get the formation of something you all might be familiar with, which is the Eddie Bravo Invitational, EBI. Now, Eddie Bravo Invitational did pay cash prizes for winning. For the most part, the winner got a $20,000 grand prize, and then there was other bonuses you can get. But the interesting thing, the thing of note about the Eddie Bravo Invitational is that that's when jiu-jitsu really started to be seen. And what do I mean by that? Of course, people in the sport had already seen it. The EBI tournaments, while small, started to have the beginnings of this spectacle of which we know of jiu-jitsu. They looked a little bit different. Keep in mind, a lot of these tournaments up until now had been your classic tournament setting with 6, 8, 10 mats at a time and everybody's going. The EBI, you saw a little more focused, okay, this match is going on, everybody watch this match. Of course, different tournaments, different times, things were a little bit different, but I think EBI is when people started to say, okay, now we're starting to move towards having this spectacle event, which again becomes relevant the closer we get to the modern day in our timeline. So shortly after this, in 2015, Higa Machado actually started the Jiu-Jitsu World League. Now the Jiu-Jitsu World League, again, brought some money into this. They had $250,000 in total cash prizes the year they formed, again, 2015. Another organization formed this year, and that was an organization called Fight to Win. Now, Fight to Win, I'm not going to talk about money with, but I included this because, say what you will about Fight to Win, they do a great job of making Jiu-Jitsu into a spectacle. Typically their events are on raised stages, lights, smoke, all this stuff that some people might deem unnecessary. But keep in mind, to the average sports fan, that stuff's pretty normal. When you watch an NFL football game or an NHL hockey game, that stuff with the music and the lights and all that, that's pretty normal. And then we were also, by 2015, the UFC was very popular. So when people thought about combat sports, thinking about the UFC, lights, big stage, everything's focused on the fighters. And so organizations like Fight to Win, I think, started to realize, okay, this can be a real spectacle. Let's look at what Eddie Bravo did with EBI and kind of just take it to the next level. And that brings us to 2017. So I'm going to declare 2017 the beginning of the modern era in Jiu-Jitsu, and I'm 100% right about that, and nobody can argue. Of course, argue all you want. But I'm calling 2017, for the purposes of this video, the beginning of the modern era of what we recognize as Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu competition. So what happened in 2017 that I'm saying this? Well, again, I said this is the start of the modern era. I'm not saying this is the end-all, be-all, this is the modern era and that's it. But what happened was, this is the year that Gordon Ryan beat Craig Jones at EBI. And a lot of you probably remember that match. If you haven't seen it, go watch it, study your jiu-jitsu history, because it's very, very important. It put both of those guys on the map, so to speak. Comment about how much you disagree with that statement in the comments. I can already hear the typing. But it's also the first year that Gordon Ryan won ADCC. Now, you're watching this video and you're saying, well, Gordon Ryan, to me, doesn't define the modern era of jiu-jitsu. Okay, that's fine. I mean, I get it. But for the sake of this video, that's what we're rolling with here. Let's move on. So in 2018, one championship started to get involved with submission grappling. And sometimes I think in our sport, we don't focus on one as much as I think we should. Because that was the first time we had a massive international league giving out paid contracts to grapplers. Now, of course, before this, we had prize money. Of course, before this, we had sponsorship deals, we had instructionals, we had everything like that. But this is the first time that we're seeing this big organization give out paid fight contracts to submission grapplers, which becomes very relevant because it furthers this idea that jiu-jitsu, for some people, can be a viable way to make a living. Of course, even to this day, that's a small number of people, but it is a realistic possibility at this point. So in 2019, Mo Jassim becomes the head of ADCC. Now, again, say you like Mo, you don't like Mo. Point is, in 2019, he became the head of ADCC, and if we're going to talk about pay in jiu-jitsu and we're going to talk about jiu-jitsu being a spectacle, we have to bring Mo up, because Mo would go on to do things like bring on Seth Daniels from Fight to Win to kind of increase the spectacle of jiu-jitsu. Mo would go on to be a big part of the decision that, as of when this video comes out, there is jiu-jitsu taking place in the T-Mobile Arena. Agree with it or disagree with it, that's happening this weekend, and Mo is a big part of it. So Mo becoming head of ADCC, I think, is a pretty significant factor. Remember, this is 2019, so now we're only talking a few years ago, and I think a lot of us understand how the events transpired from then to now, but we're going to go ahead and recap it anyway. But before we get into all the ADCC stuff, in 2021, the UFC forms the Fight Pass Invitational. Now, it's not exactly what One Championship's doing by putting grappling on the same card as fighting, as the same card as kickboxing, but it does show that the world's biggest fighting organization is interested in submission grappling. Now, I don't know the exact numbers people get paid. I've talked to a couple people. I have some estimates. The point is, when you have an organization like the UFC paying, while you might know about their controversy with their fighter pay, and a topic for another video, that type of organization is going to be shelling out real money for grappling. That year was also the year that the Rotolo brothers signed to One Championship, so now you have two of the biggest names in our sport, two young guys who represent the sport, getting a contract with this huge, again, international organization that is paying grapplers. Now, something else happened in 2021 that you might not actually be familiar with. I know I wasn't really familiar with it until I did the research for this video. A league called the Abu Dhabi Grand Slam formed, and the Abu Dhabi Grand Slam actually paid out $1,525,000 in total prize money for the 2021-2022 season. Now, that's a pretty big number, especially compared to these numbers we've been talking about. We're over the $1 million in total prize money. Now, how that was divvied up is a little different than how other organizations are doing it, but that was the total prize money that was given out in that 2021 to 2022 season. So now we're seeing those really big numbers start to come in to submission grappling. And between 2021 and 2024, of course, we had this every event was bigger, be it IBJJF Worlds or the ADCC trials or even the Opens. I went to a bunch of those Opens and it was nuts. It was like, the amount of people that were there, the amount of people who were competing that were, gung-ho about placing in trials so they could go to work. It was crazy. So now that brings us to the current year, 2024, and a man from Australia named Craig Jones decided grapplers are not getting paid enough. Now, I don't know if Craig actually decided that in 2024, but 2024 signifies the birth of the Craig Jones Invitational, CJI. As many of us know, that tournament, as it stands right now, has two divisions. The grand prize for those two divisions is $1 million cash prize. You get $10,001 to show up, and there are several super fights on the card where, while the prize money or the money for that is undisclosed, we can make some assumptions that it's probably pretty good. So we talked about earlier in the timeline that in 1998, ADCC revolutionized Jiu-Jitsu by paying $10,000 to win your division at ADCC. Well, now it's 2024, and to win your division at ADCC, you can receive $10,000. Now, to be fair, and to give ADCC credit where the credit is due, there are prizes for second and third place. You can win the absolute division. There are numerous other incentive prizes for best submission, this, that, the other thing. So again, to be completely fair, ADCC has gone and raised the prize money for the women this year to $6,000 to win your division. So this isn't a video to bash ADCC or anything like that. If you guys have seen the channel before, I'm a huge ADCC fan. I have some friends competing this weekend. I think as a submission grappling fan, this is possibly the greatest weekend we've ever had. We have the biggest ADCC event ever going on at the same time as this new CJI with these crazy $1 million grand prizes and super fights. And it's just a really good weekend to be a submission grappling fan. And I think most of us that are going to be tuned in this weekend are familiar with a lot of the more modern story of what's going on right now, but I wanted to make this video to give some sort of background and celebrate the fact that our sport has come from, Brazilian guys fighting on a beach in Rio to now in an arena in Las Vegas and a smaller college arena, whatever the Thomas and Mack Center is, also in Las Vegas. So I just think it's a really good time to be a submission grappling fan, and I wanted to make this video to, again, celebrate the journey of how we got to where we are. But if you guys like this video, all I ask is that you do everything every other YouTuber asks you to do. Like, comment, subscribe, share the video. That helps me out a lot. If you want to support the channel in other ways, I'm very active over on Instagram. You can follow @peopledoingmartialarts. Everything will be linked below. If you really want to support the channel, you can head over to my merch store, which will also be linked below, PDMAstore.com. You can get one of these cool camo hats. We have t-shirts, we have rain jackets. We have pretty cool stuff over at PDMAstore.com, so check that out. But I'm going to sign off for now. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.